Are people really getting smarter in this generation? Well, that's a good question. We certainly have heard the statistics that knowledge has increased in this era of human society and civilization. But let's go back and look at a few things before we rush to judgment. Number one, the type of knowledge that each culture endeavors to uncover is somewhat different because the issues in each age is defined according to the generations who interpret them. Number one. Number two, we do not know how smart many ancient peoples were because 99.58% or more of their knowledge doesn't exist in our world anymore. So how do we compare a known with an unknown? Number three, we can only take the knowledge graphs from our level of understanding and begin to work with them. Some of the informational graphs look like this. From Jesus and the Apostle Paul's period of roughly 2,000 years ago in Judea, for human knowledge to be communicated in the ancient world by letters and through ships and oral traditions, it took 1,500 years to the time of Columbus for human knowledge to double. Now, this is based on, that ships didn't change very much. We were still, without electricity, and, we lived pretty much the way the ancients had lived for centuries. So knowledge grew with separate communities a lot slower than it does today with mass communication. But let us continue. Then, from the days of Columbus, it took another 300 years with the advent of the movable printing press for human knowledge to double by 1850. Just about the time of the Millerite and the revolutionary religious movements took place here in North America. Well, then it took 50 years. Then we were roughly at 1900. And look what had just happened in the years preceding the Civil War. When we study the steam engine that started with Fulton in 1769, if we want to go back that far, and begin the, of course, mechanical revolution. By the end of the 1830s, they were working with, currents to send through wires and then ultimately telegraph. And of course, by 1875, Alexander Graham Bell married that technology, of course, into the telephone with a microphone. And then, of course, by 1895, they were sending radio signals for more than a mile in Italy. And, of course, you had the great Tesla begin to challenge Edison. And, of course, the fight over AC and DC theory was, of course, at a great pitch at that time. And overnight, from a horse and buggy westward moving culture to the modern age with Henry Ford, and Jerry Reed used to sing, "Lord, Mr. Ford, what have you done?" In his lament about the automobile. But from that moment on, of course, we had AM radio in 1906. with full-time radio stations by 1920, and the legendary KDKA Pittsburgh, which is still on the air today. And lo and behold, by the late 20s, they were experimenting with television. Armstrong invented the FM modulated radio wave, and of course, then they could clean up the television from amplitude modulation and modulate with a 6 kilohertz bandwidth, part FM and part AM, and then synchronize the signal, and you could have video and audio. They were doing this in Britain in 1935. And then, of course, by 1942, the early elements of the computer began to be developed from mechanical computations. And on things went. Jet engines. The Nazis developed the magnetic tape scenario, and we developed the wire recorder by the Chicago company, way back in the 1920s. And these were the early cockpit type recorders during World War II. And so, all of a sudden, after the war, with the development of sonar technology, then lasers, and then, of course, the bomb in 1945 was developed, then hydrogen bombs, and everything at lightning speed began to be developed. Then, of course, information could be sent all over the world after 1957, not only through phone and network lines, which had been the case since 1938, but was now done through satellites, which began with Sputnik in 1957. But back to our human knowledge equation. Are people getting smarter? Well, what is interesting about that question is it assumes, because the variety of knowledge is out there like never before, that the average Sunday go-to-meeting person is smarter than our predecessors were. And one can really challenge that notion. But we must be careful. From 1900 to 1950, knowledge doubled again. Then it began to double every 20 years. Then by 1980, with the advent of not quite the personal computer, we weren't quite there yet with the internet at home, but just before the internet was developed, knowledge was doubling in the academic journals every 4 months. You could not put a set of commentaries out there before they were simply outdated. Now, of course, with the personal computer and the internet and, of course, iPods and so many other modern devices, too numerous to even consider to mention here, then knowledge is, of course, being transmitted by trillions and trillions of little sound bites over the World Wide Web from universities and theological and every other type of academic journal possible. And yet, folks, it is sad to say that our people are reading less. The average person who goes to church says, the Pew study, less than 4% are daily reading the biblical text. So if we lose our story, what have we got to share with anybody? What theological questions can we even attempt to answer unless we're willing to do deep study and confront the apologist who on a daily basis are challenging the very framework of Christianity? And it's not just Christianity, but Western values and Western society right along with that particular paradigm. Our SAT scores in America are down. Rather than use a vocabulary of 4,000 words, the average American improperly uses about 300 words. We're barely above the ghetto in our use of our own language. Just go back and listen to the speeches of an Al Smith or an Adlai Stevenson. Listen to the superlatives. Listen to the critical analyzation that went on as people debated in Oxford and Cambridge. Some debates in ancient Greece lasted for more than a decade over one word. It's because they wanted to play out the scenario with a dramatic type theatrical rhetorical analysis that would just absolutely lose most of us in this day and age. Now, the vocabulary changes. Things like spreadsheets and others, of course, we would not have used as little as 40 years ago. You'd say, well, I'm not in a hotel, and we know the computer age has also helped bring English to be the international language. We also can tell as you watch foreign newscasts that oftentimes they are more eloquent than their American counterparts because they're writing from a standpoint of journalism and not corporate ratings. I've heard people with 6 years of college at master's level who absolutely cannot form a sentence. It'd be humorous if it wasn't tragic. Just the basic skill sets that used to be known 40 years ago about American history, the Constitution, and civics are no longer known by most young people. Mechanical skill sets, practical skill sets on how to work on the devices and repair them in your houses that most people on the farm who grew up, even in city life, learned how to have. Those trade type skills are vastly diminishing in lieu of computer skills. So in other words, we're being funneled into just a few basic directions in our modern culture. The breadth of the classical educational model is gone for almost a trade school type of an approach across the board. So we are losing context in this soundbite generation. Over and over again, you hear people say, well, we're using more of our brains now. But if they would really study the neurosurgical type of topics that are mapped in the brain, what we notice here is that we're using more parts of the brain. It's not true we only use 10%. We use all different parts of the brain where the lights, are tracked all over the brain, but we're only using a small percentage of it at any one given time. So once again, how do we define whether or not we're smarter when our knowledge base is different? Well, it may be different, but we've lost a lot of basic skills along with the narrowing skill sets of today's modern life. This is Father Tom Roberts saying, thank you for listening, and never forget to think and feel things critically.